Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this special and important panel conversation on the budgeting process and its impact on youth. I'm your host, Khaleem Ali, Youth Peace and Security Consultant. Thank you all for tuning in via the Parliament channel, ParlView on YouTube, and Radio 105.5 FM. Today's discussion holds significant importance in relation to Commonwealth Youth Day, which was observed on Monday, March 13, 2023, and the ongoing recognition of the Year for the Youth 2023 as announced by the Commonwealth Secretariat. Before we dive into our discussion this morning, let's take a moment to appreciate the purpose of our conversation. With the Year for Youth 2023 and Commonwealth Day in mind, we aim to shed light on the crucial relationship between youth and the budgeting process, exploring how fiscal decisions can positively impact the lives of young individuals. Throughout our discussion, we encourage you, our viewing and listening audience, to actively engage with us. Feel free to share your thoughts, questions, and suggestions in the comment section or via our social media platforms. Please allow me to introduce our esteemed panelists who bring a wealth of knowledge, fresh perspectives, and expertise to the table. Joining us this morning is Dr. Marlene Attzs, an esteemed economist from the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus, Mr. Lawrence Arjoon, the Chief Executive Officer of the Heroes Foundation, Mrs. Leeooi-Oneika Howard, a trade specialist representing Trinidad and Tobago's Chamber of Industry and Commerce, and of course, Dr. Henry Charles, a distinguished youth development specialist whose work has positively impacted countless young individuals. Good morning, panelists.
Good morning, Khaleem.
Before we start our conversation this morning, we have the privilege of getting a little mini lecture, a little taste of the UE experience from Dr. Marlene Attzs, who is going to be giving us a short presentation on the youth and the budgeting process. So, Dr. Attzs, take it away.
Thanks a lot, Khaleem. Not quite a UE experience, but occupational hazard. You know, you have to do a little slide presentation. I wanted to thank you again, thank the Parliament for inviting us and inviting me, youth adjacent as I am, to be part of this conversation. So I just wanted to put up essentially two slides to kind of frame my contribution today, youth and the budget process. Now, the first thing that I want to say is that really this is a conversation around good governance and really how do we engage some key stakeholders, our youth, in the conversation. That is an important conversation. I saw in the promotional material for today's session, yes, economists rule the world. I always tell people that. And the budgeting process really is how do we use limited resources that we have in Trinidad and Tobago to help us deal with a host of issues that we want to deal with in the country in any fiscal year. So it's important for us to understand that from the outset, and important for us to understand how do we use those limited resources essentially to satisfy or to address some of the needs of the stakeholders and the population throughout the country. And I think that is really where we're starting the conversation today. And I wanted to remind, the last time I sat in these hallowed halls, I had a different diagram up, so I decided I would do something a little different this time. Who are we? And I put the we there in the capitals and bold. Who are we as youth? And I think it's important for us, given the definitions of youth, we're talking about persons between the ages of 15 to 35 or thereabout. We're really talking about those persons that we categorized in modern day parlance as millennials and the Gen Zs. And I think that is an important starting point, because the way the baby boomers would have reacted in a societal context, the way the Gen Xers would have reacted in a societal context, would be in some ways different from the ways in which the millennials and the Gen Zs will engage in the society. And I think we have to start with that as a basic point of departure, because the way in which we deal with our youth and the way in which we engage our youth, not just in the budgetary processes, but also in other kinds of governance arrangements, I think we have to understand that some differences are required. So I think the first thing is understanding who we are as youth, and I'm going to harp on the fact that we are youth as I carry on. But also to note, as you said in your introductory statement, that our annual budget presented usually around September, early October every year for the following fiscal year, usually highlights a number of issues that either directly or indirectly impact on youth, those persons between the ages of 15 and 35 or thereabouts. And I just wanted to extract from the budgets of yesteryear some of those issues. Issues that address employment and underemployment among our youth. So we've had mention in various budgets about apprenticeship programs, national service programs under the Ministry of Youth Development and National Service, my NDS. I always forget the full name, but I always talk my NDS. We have the adjustments to the GATE program that came back in 2015. We have conversations around digital transformation. We have conversations around crime and national security, conversations around climate change and low carbon strategy for the country, conversations around sport and youth development centers, conversations around food security and youth and agriculture. And I've just, as I said, extracted these particular talking points, so to speak, or headlines, because in one way or the other, directly or indirectly, they all impact on youth. But the question is, have youth been involved in those conversations? So, for example, when the GATE program was adjusted, and as an economist, I appreciated that the fortunes for Trinidad and Tobago were different in 2015, 2016, when the adjustment was made to the GATE program. So I understand that some tweaking needed to be done to the GATE program. But this directly impacted our youth, for persons between the ages of 15 and 35. They heard in a budget presentation that things were going to change in terms of how they access the education system, tertiary level education, and were youth involved in those conversations. Certainly, the hue and cry that was heard publicly after the announcement was made suggests that youth were not involved in the conversations around the adjustments to the GATE program. One of the things that I always I feel very strongly about in Trinidad and Tobago, particularly given conversations around economic diversification, etc., is how do we engage in manpower planning and skills development, particularly for our millennials and our Gen Zs. These are the next generation of movers and shakers in Trinidad and Tobago. And I think while we recognize the economy is heavily dependent on the oil and gas sector, we also know that there have been conversations that require Trinidad and Tobago to transition out of non-renewables into renewables, which is going to have an impact on our next generations. And are they involved in these conversations as we present our national budgets, as we talk about things like climate change? How do we engage our youth in those conversations on issues that will directly impact on them, will directly impact on their education trajectory, will directly impact on their employment and their career trajectories? The whole question of crime and national security is a hot topic in Trinidad and Tobago. The last time I was present, I was privileged to participate in this conversation. I presented data on youth as victims, but also youth as perpetrators of crime. There is another side that occurred to me as I was preparing for today. Our Gen Zs and our millennials coming out of the womb a little more technical savvy than some of us youth-adjacent persons might be. So the ways in which they will engage in criminal activity or victims, that also is going to change. So if we're talking about addressing crime and national security, it is not simply about allocating more of the resources, but understanding the dynamics of crime and security. And particularly, there's a conversation around youth in crime and national security, as I said, either as victims or as perpetrators. We need to understand the dynamics and how that nexus has been changing. And then, of course, sport and youth development, etc. Where will the next Brian Lara, the next Usain Bolt, the next Russell Latapi, how do we engage our youth to ensure that the allocations that are made for youth and youth development in our national budgets actually are directed in the ways that will allow our youth to self-actualize and to realize their full potential. Essentially, the last slide that I had, I know I didn't want to occupy too much of the time, why youth must be engaged in the budget process. As I said, it's really a question of good governance, ensuring that our budget processes reflect the needs, and we can't satisfy all of the needs of the entire population, but how do we engage stakeholders in a meaningful way to ensure that there is good governance in terms of how our budgets are presented? And as I note in this first point, the national budget should be reflective of shared priorities and goals and a commitment to public participation and collaborative governance. And I put their tongue in cheek that it's ironic that, you know, when we have election campaigning, youth are the people that you see in the forefront because they're the ones who have the technical savvy. They know how to come up with the best jingles. They know how to do all of these things. But after that time is done, then we kind of abandon our youth. And I see other youth-adjacent persons around the table nodding their heads. You know, so it makes sense if we know that the value that our youth bring to the table, then really and truly we need to nurture them through that process. Youth involvement can yield creative solutions to tackle some issues such as small and medium enterprise development and economic diversification. Tap into that creativity. I mean, I've resigned myself to how attached young persons are to their mobile phones and all of their technical gadgets. I've resigned myself because really and truly they really are quite creative and they use that as a tool for the trade. Why not tap into that so that when we are in fact framing some of these policy decisions, it reflects what the next generation can feel comfortable, the baton that they can feel comfortable taking and running forward with it so that it redounds to the benefit of the country. There is research that shows that encouraging young people to participate in civic processes increases the likelihood of them wanting to be involved in civic life and to elevate themselves through the governance system and also ensure that there is good governance as they move into adulthood. As I mentioned, the whole question of harnessing their digital savviness to allow for better understanding of what the population wants and also for information dissemination. So you hardly will find a young person, a youth, who will buy a newspaper. They go online, they access the information differently. So it means that you have a ready source of disseminating information, the right kinds of information, and allow for a two-way kind of conversation and two-way flow of information if youth are in fact involved. But it also allows for transparency as part of good governance, and it builds trust. Without trust, we're not going to get the kinds of results that we want in Trinidad and Tobago. And then, of course, I think my final overarching point has to come back to the question around sustainable development. If we are seriously having conversations nationally around sustainable development at the core talks about inter- and intragenerational equity. So decisions that governments make today will have an impact on several generations. And one of the points that I put there is including conversations around debt management. The debt that we're incurring in Trinidad and Tobago today, and I know in one of the central bank reports I read, certainly for this year, probably the first quarter report I read, the local debt, the national debt is increasing. The international debt is declining. But the burden of that debt is going to fall on the youth. So it stands to reason that issues such as incurring debt, issues such as expenditures that the government may be engaging in, it makes good governance and good sense for youth to be involved in parts of those conversations. I know that it's not everything that people will have the opportunity to be engaged in terms of those conversations, but it makes good sense so that the persons to whom we hand the baton in future generations, they will know what they're getting into and they will do that as willing and able citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. So I want to end my brief presentation there, budgeting process 101. So I want to start. So thanks again for that opportunity to start the conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Attzs, for that concise yet very insightful presentation. You know, I made some notes paying attention to the fact that, you know, you would have mentioned that the budgeting process needs to be representative, and in being representative of the different age groups, we also have to understand that what we're dealing with are limited resources, and we have to figure out how do we address the needs of our nation in its current state without compromising our sustainable development. And a large part of that conversation is definitely consulting with and engaging our young people. So at this point in time, I want to open up the floor to some of our other panelists to hear their thoughts on the presentation. And, you know, let's get the conversation going. So, Lawrence, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Again, thank you to the Parliament for allowing me to be here to represent the voices of young people in Trinidad and Tobago. I mean, Dr. Attz's presentation was clear. Young people are the future. The policies, the decisions that we make today they are the ones who we are making it for. So how do we ensure that they are part of the process? Budgeting is a mechanism for us to be able to deliver on our strategy, to deliver on our vision. So to have young people included in the budgeting process means that we need to have youth inclusion beyond that. We need to have youth inclusion in all of the development areas, in all of the strategies, and all of the planning work that goes into deciding what is the Trinidad and the Tobago that we want and we want to build. So I wanna take the conversation into that direction, because at the end of the day, the Ministry of Finance, which presents the budget, is pooling together information that comes from all across Trinidad and Tobago, from the state, from the different ministries, from the private sector, from the chambers, from the different organizations. The question is, if we are serious as a country on youth inclusion and meaningful youth inclusion, how are we as a country including young people in all of these spaces so that their voices are included in the planning? Because the planning and the strategy influences the budget. And I'll break it down in the DEI language and the ESG language. So if you look at it from a DEI perspective, including young people in your budget, I mean, Dr. Attzs spoke about it, that intergenerational equity. The decisions that we are making have long-term impact. How are we planning for that? How are we facilitating that in the decision making? Empowerment and ownership. We want young people to have national pride and patriotism. So they have to be included in the process in a meaningful way where they feel as if and they believe that their contributions are helping to build the Trinidad and Tobago that they want. Innovation, Dr. Attzs spoke about that. I mean, it is clear what young people bring to the table. And social cohesion and trust. Trust is a huge part of building a safe and sustainable society. And including young people in all of the areas is going to help build that. Because there is a gap. There is a gap currently between the younger generations and the older generations. There's also a language barrier. Mm-hmm. The generations speak very differently. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, everybody essentially wants the same thing. But we're going to have to do some work to get to there. And that's where the meaningful youth inclusion comes in.
Thank you very much for those thoughts, Lawrence. Now, Dr. Charles, I want to go a little bit off of what Lawrence just said in terms of, recognizing that every generation's priority is different, or their priorities are different. So how do we balance competing priorities in the budgeting process to ensure that we are able to reach some level of consensus or satisfy as many people as possible without jeopardizing or compromising young people's ability to be developed, to have that level of investment that they need?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just thank the organizers, the Parliament Office, the opportunity again. And I, in all sincerity, it coming from the Parliament Office suggests that there's some hope, because I don't think there are many parliaments in the region that would even think of organizing something, an event like that. So somewhere along the line, something is happening. There is some hope. And I listen attentively to Dr. Attzs here and Lawrence here. Yes, first of all, I remember when the youth policy was being done, the chronological definition of youth 10 to 35 suggests that they were about 45 to 46% of the population. Mm-hmm. So talk about the equity from a straight standpoint of the demographic significance of youth. Yeah, so that says clearly, you cannot engage in no kind of serious policy development, future planning without having that significant demographic group on board. More than that, I don't think the case has been made again. I think it is about the action going forward. Why I say that is because if you look at the national youth policy at Trinidad and Tobago, it clearly articulates what you're saying there in terms of the pillars of the policy, talks to young people being involved in rural development, in climate change, even the question of crime. it didn't talk about just young people just as perpetrators or as victims. It spoke of young people as strategic partners in creating safe spaces and all of those. So in essence, the framework is already there. The SDGs call for building inclusive cities, inclusive processes. These are already there, and I think the government of Trinidad and Tobago has either bought into by being signatories, or from the policy standpoint, it is a document that the Cabinet of Ministers has approved. Perhaps the thing is how. That to me is how. And I think there is an approach that they can look at. It's an approach that is used by the World Bank and even the Caribbean Development Bank, where young people are look at through what we call a three-lens approach to engagement. One is of young people as targets or beneficiaries, which is part of the point that was made, that they are beneficiaries, they need the investments in gate, investments in several areas. So, and certainly you cannot decide that I will interpret what are those needs and priorities. So in order for you to be on target, and it is even more important and critical in a situation where you have challenges, what they call fiscal challenges, and limited resources. Absolutely. For you to be sure that you're not wasting, well, one for a better phrase, wasting
more efficient use,
or the inefficient use of the thing. The other area, the way that you can engage, to make sure you get this going in the process as collaborators, right? The policy, the theme of the national policy is co-creating sustainable futures, meaning that the young people are co-creators. But I don't know that you can have you can create a process and one of the parties outside of the process. So you need to engage them and work out how they are going to be engaged. I know in some jurisdictions, the concept of parliamentarism comes up. Well, we were the elected persons, and we are the ones in the authority to decide. I mean, the world is moving ahead of that. We recognize and respect the role of elected parliamentarians and that kind of thing. But we know the conversation and development, whether it's in economics, in all areas, is about deepening that process of governance. Absolutely. It's about further democratizing the process of governance. So here again is a basis of how do we engage the young people. And of course, the third area is of youth as initiators or taking the lead. The question of the innovation, that they have this, is a phrase that very often, but it's a phrase called ephibophobia, meaning the fear of youth. That, oh God, boy, if we give them to do this, if we put the thing in their hand, if we put them in charge of it, oh God, boy, the Titanic will sink kind of thing, But as initiators, there are things, we look at the thing of the millennials and Gen Z, we talk about the different ways that they come into the process, the different ways that they impact and engage with the process. Why not engage them in taking the lead in those areas? I mean, even I like to use, even from a biblical standpoint, they have this thing about those who drunk from the old wine have place for the new wine. So, there are some of those things that we cannot pretend, what do you call it, adjacent youth? We can't pretend to have the competence in those areas, and we should allow young people to be able to take take the lead and give them the support. Take the lead and give them the support in that. In fact, one of the areas I think on the budget thing, I have a few other points, but just quickly, one of the areas I think we can start to think of, and when Lawrence talked about they get information from everywhere and shipping the budget, not necessarily so. I don't know that there's ever been an environment or a framework or some kind of a space where young people are engaged. I'm not talking about the tokenistic thing of young people. The diverse Trinidad and Tobago youth population is brought in to have serious conversation on the economic realities and the economic future or the development future.
Town hall meetings.
Even, for instance, in the post-COVID I think the Prime Minister had taken a decision to initiate this team that was going to help the government develop some kind of a
roadmap to recovery.
Yeah, young people were not included.
They were not.
As a matter of fact, a group of young people led by Amilka and some others took an initiative, and they went out and do their work, and they prepared a paper which they submitted to the government. So I am proposing one thing there quickly, that I believe they should, and I don't think it's too late, budget in September, although the process is going on now. So you have people here who could facilitate it. A national youth economic forum. Call it symposium, call it forum, but it has to be something, not just engage people seriously. Provide the technical support, to help get the research papers done. There are young people who are economists, who are qualified in all the areas. Get them on board. Get serious work done. Okay, and create a space, demonstrate how what that comes out of that is brought into the broader process of the thing. So I want to stop here
and if I may just, I know our colleague from the chamber, but on the last occasion I was here, I spoke of an open budget initiative, which is a global initiative which has as part and parcel of that those kinds of opportunities for youth. And I just want to piggyback one additional thought on your very well received suggestion, and I would be happy to facilitate, of course. It should be both urban and rural, because the needs of urban youth and rural youth are very different. And I wouldn't want us to have this kind of convergence where we think that, all youth are the same and their needs are the same. I think COVID-19 taught us that we really need to understand the varying dynamics among our youth population and what their needs are. So the policy
is very clear in indicating that even though the chronological definition for youth is 10 to 45, recognize that young people are not a homogeneous group.
That's correct, absolutely.
All social identities have to be taken
and their socialization is very different.
And of course, the issue of intersectionality will come into play, because several youth are impacted by different types of issues. So, for now.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Charles and Dr. Attzs. So, definitely paying attention to the buzzwords that we're throwing around. We have to look at young people as collaborators, as partners, as beneficiaries, co-creators, and deepen the level of thought that goes into decision making, involving young people and allowing them to consult from planning phase straight into the enacting part of it. Something that I think is interesting that came out of this conversation from the beginning is the fact that for a lot of young people, we perceive budget as budget day when the Minister of Finance comes and he gives his speech. And we do not understand the intricacies and all the behind-the-scenes work that has to go into that one-day speech. We don't understand that it's a process that starts from May, before the fiscal year even starts or is even close to an end, where all ministries, departments, state agencies have to submit their estimates, revenue, expenditure to the ministry. So it's where we tend to focus on this one speech without having any sort of appreciation for what has informed that one speech. But then the question is what is informing that speech representative of what young people want? And that is what I'm getting from the conversation we're having today, that there needs to be some level of greater collaboration and meaningful engagement, not just, as Dr. Charles mentioned, tokenistic engagement. So, Leeoi, I want you to now come in and tell me, we're talking about this within the context of government, and government plays, of course, the driving role in the budgeting process. But what do you think is the role of the private sector in this budgeting process, in getting young people involved, in empowering young people? How can the private sector contribute to this conversation?
Okay, so good morning, everyone, and thank you for the Parliament for having me. It's very nice to be probably one of the youngest person on this panel this morning to contribute to not youth adjacent, but youth direct, right? So before I answer your question, I just wanted to touch on a couple of things. Tokenism, participation, and meaningful engagement. And what does that mean for us as young people? And I will start by saying we are invited to some meetings. we are invited to some symposiums and to participate on somewhat high-level discussion, but it doesn't go beyond that. And for us, we need to be a part of not just the planning, but we need to be a part of the execution. We need to be an integral part of the intervention, not that you take an idea that we may bring forward and you coin it or you make it into something that is very far from what we actually envisioned, but to have us continually be a part of the process. And it's not just a matter of coming to a symposium or being a part of preparing for the budget, but it's a all-year round type of initiative. It's having us included right through at all times, not just when you need to ensure that, well, we had a percentage of young people at a particular project or involved, but to ensure that what is being done benefits us, is for us, and is being done by us. From the part of the private sector, to answer your question directly, as a member of the chamber and as a representative of the chamber, one thing that we tend to do is have a post-budget symposium. It's not youth-focused, I would say, but it is business-focused. And within the business community, there are a lot of entrepreneurs. When we look at the SMEs, most of them, they do fall within that youth, millennials, the Gen Ys, the Gen Zs, that generation, right? And we do get them to be able to voice their concerns. So our post-budget forum allows the minister and other high-level members of the Ministry of Finance to come in, and you have engagement directly, whereby they can ask questions about the budget which would have been read, and to get just a little deeper inspiration as to what is really going on, why was those decisions taken and made, right? What you tend to see happening is while you have that discussion, there aren't much platforms for it to continue thereafter. Right? So we would talk about the challenges, we will propose solutions, but the monitoring and evaluation of if those ideas were actually taken into play, sometimes it doesn't happen. So even within that context, we need the youth to be more engaged. But how do we facilitate that? So I want to just take a look at how our ministries are set up. So the budget is a collaboration of all the different ministries sending their proposals to the Minister of Finance. We know that our ministries are generally operated and held hands by our permanent secretaries. Just how permanent secretaries are selected excludes the youth. Is that an issue? So that's outright exclusion because it's by seniority. So it's within the discretion of our PSs to determine whether they are going to listen to the youth within their care, because yes, we do have youths working within the ministries, but are they being heard? How do we evaluate that? What level of transparency do we see on a day-to-day to address those type of issues? So I would say no, that the representation is not there. And then we do have some NGOs and some civil society partners who can give us a certain level of representation, but then they are generally not invited to the high table where the decisions are being made, where implementation and strategies are actually being executed.
Okay. Very, very thought-provoking, I have to say. You raised a lot of important things. I think for myself as a young person, I too often feel almost disadvantaged by this culture of seniority equates experience and equates ability. And I think that as young people, specifically, you know, for myself as someone from the Gen Z generation, Gen Z has proven itself, I think, that we're capable of stirring the tides, shaking things up, bringing fresh ideas and fresh perspectives. But if you bring a fresh perspective, you know, into a room where you just have settled practice, how is it going to be allowed to...
How is it received?
Yeah, how are we going to receive it? So Dr. Attzs, let me give that question to you. What do you think are some internal changes, perhaps, that ministries, organizations, both public and private, can make to foster meaningful engagement for young people?
All right, so I'm going to spin that question in the way in which I received some of what our chamber colleague and Dr. Charles and also Lawrence, I'm going to spin the question in terms of what I've received from them. and ask a question. I don't know that anyone in this room, on this panel, can answer it, but does our education system, as it is currently constructed, does it allow for us to understand that education is really meant to be a creative process that allows you to self-actualize? I mean, it's the word that I learned when I did management studies a long time ago as a youth-adjacent person, but it's something that I've always maintained, that really development and the process and all of the various issues that contribute to development, either national development or individual development, is really should be things that allow an individual to self-actualize. And I start with our education system, and it is not a conversation around the Ministry of Education, but our education system that involves how our young people are socialized and how our young people, who then become the leaders in their respective agencies, how their socialization allows them to view others coming up behind. Because if your socialization is one that says either A, you need to have a certain kind of paper qualification for you to be qualified, and you know, we all will have different perspectives on that. Or if your socialization or your education says that it is by seniority and you do not recognize the value that someone who is young and creative. So if I had the opportunity, I know everything now, most of marketing, information dissemination is done on social media platforms, on digital platforms. If I had a young creative person who did not need to be in my office, but would sit quietly at home and do all that needed to be done, and I'd have the best sort of social media platform, I would embrace that. I don't necessarily need to see that you have qualifications. It might help because we live in a space where you need to have little qualifications and those sorts of things. But it comes out of COVID-19, and I've often said COVID-19 was a good crisis. You saw things like food drops, all of those apps, all of the transportation systems, the TT ride shares, all of those things that came out of creative minds because we were in a crisis, because we had no other choice. You couldn't leave your house. Everybody was waiting with bated breath for the Prime Minister to come out, and whether he was in his suit or whether he was in his, you know, there were all of these memes about, depending on what he wears, you know, it's going to be some pressure and some pain. But we used the opportunity to tap into the creativity that came primarily from a lot of our young people. So I come back to the question, how do we change the system? I don't know that we can change the system overnight, but I think it begins with a question of our education system. How do we perceive education and its broadest sense? As I said, it's not a conversation around the Ministry of Education, but how do we train people to think creatively? Because one of the challenges that we see at the end of the spectrum is that because we're not taught to think creatively, if someone comes into your office and thinks creatively, you're not too comfortable with that, because A for apple, B for bat, C for cat. That's how you would. So anybody coming to say A for airplane or C for caterpillar, something. So it begins with that kind of socialization. It begins with a review of our policies in terms of how do we engage, how do we recruit and select people for different kinds of jobs. As it stands now, we still recruit and select in a very kind of archaic way. So it's a piece of paper stating your qualifications, that sort of thing. The engagement, the creativity in terms of how you think. So the job might say, I want you to be creative, but if you come into the interview and you're really very creative, then you get me a little uncomfortable, because again, it comes back to our socialization. So I think that there is not a quick fix for it. I think there has to be an overhaul and a recognition that some of the ways in which we do business, some of the ways in which we have been socialized, really need to be turned on its head. So these are all several parts that need to be moved almost simultaneously to help us to understand the kind of change that we want to see and what is required to essentially effect those changes. So I would say, as somebody whose primary jurisdiction is one part of the education system, I think that there is a lot to be said in terms of how we educate people and how we socialize people. And if the outcomes that we want to see are not aligned to the way in which we educate people and socialize people, then we know we will always have that misalignment and that mismatch. So that would be my short-ish response to your question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Attzs.
I'd like to jump in here. and give a solution that has been working.
Okay.
Because I'm hearing the conversations and the work that we do at the Heroes Foundation is about creating those spaces for meaningful youth inclusion. Because we've realized that young people have to create these spaces. To have meaningful youth inclusion, you need to have decision makers who are open and willing to engage. That is the starting point. But you also need people who will push for it, because change, while it is the only constant in life, is not something we are open to or receptive to or facilitate very easily. We know that. And we can talk all about how that comes from our colonial history on another panel discussion. But that is the society that we are in. And it's, I mean, we've had to manage a lot, but change, and in this rapidly changing world, we have to be willing to change, and we have to be willing and open to change. So I'll share a bit about what we do at Heroes Foundation. So Heroes has been around for the last 20 years. The primary focus has been youth development, psychosocial development, the mental health and well-being of young people, 21st century skills development, the same thing that we're talking about, what the workplace really needs. People call it soft skills, we call it critical skills. Things like critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, all of those things. That's something that Heroes has been doing for 20 years, because there's always been a need in our society to facilitate that. Then there's the sustainability education, so equality and elimination of violence, helping young people understand energy, environmental sustainability, job, career planning. That's the core work of the organization. All of that work will be for nothing if young people cannot build sustainable lives and livelihoods. So how we've expanded the organization the past few years, it's connecting young people to collaborative community activities. How do we partner with other organizations doing different work that we can't do? Because we have young people. But then the third area is, how do we get young people meaningfully involved in the decision-making process for sustainable development? So what we did, we have something called Future Forum, which is an event where we have put young people to sit down with government ministers, industry leaders, state representatives to talk about the issues. That's a start. And I will say that we have gotten a lot of support and openness from the state in an approach like that. And they do face some very hard questions from the young people. The need for collaboration and partnerships beyond that is critical, because this is work. To change the society for the better is work, and somebody has to do it. We're going to have to ensure that we have the right investments going in the right places to facilitate it. I'll give you an example of how I've seen collaborative change with young people. So when I came into Heroes Foundation in 2020, I was concerned that there were no national guidelines for safeguarding and protection, because I came from the energy sector, where HSSE is the Bible. We reached out to the Office of the Prime Minister, Gender and Child Affairs, because we work with them, expressing this concern. We had a very good conversation with the then coordinator of Child Affairs about the national child policy, which they shared, and they explained child policy, and they explained the work that they were trying to do towards a safeguarding framework, to which we said, can we be a part of this? Can we support? So Heroes was able to come on board and be part of supporting that safeguarding framework. We then were part of that, and I will always come back to it, that Judith Jones investigation into abuse at community residences. And I said it at the last panel discussion, and I'm saying it again here. There were at least 6 people by the definition of youth, myself included, under the age of 35, included in that independent investigation. And the results of that investigation speaks for itself. It calls for change. One, it calls for accepting that we have problems, that things are not completely right, but that we need change. Then there was the task force that came in place to implement the recommendations. And again, representing a youth organization, I was invited to be a part of that process. And then those recommendations went towards Cabinet, and Cabinet approved those recommendations in the last budget to move forward the recommendations coming out of the Judith Jones investigation. But that is work outside of the regular system. So we now have to look at how do we create more spaces outside of the regular system, because the regular system is maintaining. We have to keep the country afloat. We have to keep things operating. We have to keep people fed. We have to get people into school. The system our country has grown significantly since independence. So we have grown in so many different areas. We are leading the world in so many areas. That's a lot to manage in a system that has not evolved as quickly. So while the country is trying to maintain, where are the spaces being created? So yes, civil society is doing it. Heroes Foundation is doing it. Do we have open airs across the board to engage and to support the work and to facilitate the work? The Energy Chamber has been very inclusive of young people. They give us the third day to bring young people into the energy conference, to interact with the industry professionals. AmCham got us to bring young people into the ESG conferences. How are we now making these spaces together, working really collaboratively together to create those spaces for meaningful youth inclusion?
Perhaps, if you just quickly, can I? Okay. What they have a thing about Arjoon the provocateur? Right. Perhaps I could play that role as well. I have always said there are several incremental, I would refer to, underlying incremental steps that can be taken to address what seemed to be an anomaly. But I am still not convinced it's an anomaly. Mango tree do not bear pawpaw. You know, the system as it is, we see all the challenges. We see the way young people might be marginalized in a ministry because of age, or they're not supposed to have the experience and the qualification. That's what the system wants. That's how the system is established. The system is about maintaining a certain culture of power, a certain distribution of power. It's a broader thing. And that is why, for instance, the public service is not sufficiently democratized in terms of decision-making. We still have that archaic decision-making process. I did a presentation a couple of weeks ago to a grouping of the parliamentarians in St. Lucia, Prime Minister and them. And I said, when I raised the question, the people pull up, I say, why in 2023 must cabinet sit to adjudicate on scholarship winners? You know, so so in all of the things we can improve. There are a lot of incremental things we can improve, but there need to be some conversation around what is in 2023 and all of the way the global, what should define the relationship between the state and the citizenry? Yeah? Is it adequate? Is there an adequate balance of power between the state and the citizenry? You know, is the state recognizing the citizenry? I won't even say as the employers, but I will say as partners in the process of development. That is critical. Okay. But I will not finish this thing without talking about young people as well. There's a critical role for young people, not as individuals, but as organizations. You know, the question of solidarity among young people in different spaces, young people in the private sector, young people in education, UE Guild, you have TYC and TYC in Tobago. You have a range of youth things. They need to also engage in the kind of advocacy, okay, because nobody going to say, let me dismantle what is working for us, you know. If it's not working for you, you have to start to take action to create the alternative, the space that is more accommodating of you or more respectful of your opinion. So that is another area where, and I think some things happen in the Ministry of Youth, but I believe that there needs to be a greater investment in that area in terms of supporting bona fide youth-led organizations to take that mantle and to be able to build that solidarity. Whether you're working in gender, whether your forte is within higher education, Guild of Graduates, youth generally, young people in young entrepreneurs in the private sector, because what we're talking about has to transform the private sector too, you know. Because you need a new leadership, a new face of the private sector, a younger, more avant type of entrepreneur and all of that kind of thing. So, enough said. Enough said.
I think, coming out of the conversation as far, two key words keep popping up: status quo and change, and the intersectional but also anti-relationship that those two things have with each other. Yeah. And Dr. Attzs, you mentioned COVID-19, and you spoke about people being forced to be creative and being forced to innovate because of this crisis that was ongoing, And when we look at, to bring it back to the budget, when we look at the budget has been kept almost the same consistently. We have investment in the same programs over and over and over. It gets a new name, it gets a new logo, but at its core, it remains the same. Or we have the issue where so much of the money that, as Dr. Attzs mentioned, is limited, is spent on recurrent expenditure. So how do we take that status quo and implement change? Dr. Attzs mentioned, and something I thought of while I was listening to her was that whole concept of remote working, which is a big conversation we're having. If that is what we're paying so much money to have physical offices, if we save on that, what can that money then be invested into for young people? So I like the fact that this panel is not just discussing the issues, but you all are proposing solutions. And Lawrence made a very significant point as well, is that so many times when we're looking at change, we tend to look outward, but we don't look inward. We don't look within Trinidad and Tobago to see where we can take a model. And we can't say, well, the government can't learn. The government has to learn. The government has to adapt. And the best people the government can learn from is its own people at the end of the day. So I want to segue the conversation a little bit now into something that all of you all mentioned in some way or the other. This concept of creativity and this concept of innovation and the relationship between creativity and innovation and the budget, right? Let's talk about the orange economy. And Leeoy, I'm going to start with you, not because you're wearing orange, but I want to start with you to get your thoughts on where we're at in terms of investment in the orange economy. Firstly, explain the orange economy for our youth audience who may not necessarily be familiar with the concept of the orange economy, where we're at and what you think could be done to improve or foster that orange economy.
Now, it really would be remiss of me not to just address something before we segue into that. Why do we always need to wait until a crisis to move? We have all the good policies, we have the plans, we have good ideas, but we had to wait until COVID-19 to do something that youth and business organizations have been championing for and doing, as well as exporting and going to other countries to do for years. And that, to me, is a big part of what needs to be part of our solution.
See the inertia? That's what you're describing as the inertia.
Yes.
We've done it like this for the last 60 years, so why should we rock the boat?
We are unwilling as youth to just continue doing things the way we are told to do it just because. And I have to be honest, because it's one of the challenges that we have here locally, whereby they say that we are not interested in being a part of the process, that we are not interested in listening to the budget, because many young people will go about it just like any other day, right? It's not part of their ecosystem, they're part of their day. They go to a job, they get a paycheck, they can pay their bills, and that's about it. Because when it is we say that this is what we need and this is how we need it, we are told to do it this way because I said so, and because it has always been that way. So for me, part of the solution is our decision makers coming out to say, we understand that this is how we've always done it, and we know that it cannot continue that way, and we are open to hearing what you have to say and implementing what it is you have to say. So I just thought that was really, really important to bring on board. Now, the orange economy is a very interesting topic, and for many reasons, I really just want Dr. Attzs to start the overview on that for us before I really give my opinion on it, if that's okay.
I'm actually watching the time, and there's something that I want to say that you have tickled in my mind.
I'm tickling
so
you.
You're tickling me. So I want to, because I know just now you're going to get the signal, and we're going to have to start to wrap up. The whole conversation around solutions, because we're here to have a conversation, but I would not wish for us to leave with having ventilated some very useful points and not identifying a solution forward. And one of the things that was kind of germinating in my mind, and when you spoke of it, I said, well, all right, okay, so I'm not too off, why not have, as part of the national ecosystem, as part of the national architecture, a youth think tank that focuses on the budget process. So it's not anything that resides in any one of the organizations now. You're now pulling a group of stakeholders. I listened to Dr. Charles talk about youth as advocates, and I'm hearing in the back of my mind people saying that long ago, the guild used to be, this and this. And why not have, as part of the architecture, an independent think tank drawn from across various disciplines and various spaces, but youth-driven, and that think tank is really meant to keep us honest as a country, to monitor and evaluate expenditures, to see whether the return on the investment is taking us where we want to be. So it's not simply a question of accounting and saying, well, I was allocated 52 million and I therefore spent 60, so I have a deficit, etc. It's not about that. It is about that whole question of sustainable development. We're now entrenching in that think tank the responsibility to ensure that Trinidad and Tobago's sustainable future is in the right direction. They may not be able to change things because they're not the sitting government. They don't have the stamp of approval of the people of Trinidad and Tobago to change things, but they can certainly influence and monitor what is happening in the country, because they are the ones who are going to have to inherit, take the reins for the country in years to come. So monitor the debt situation, interrogate that. We had to borrow during COVID-19 because of certain circumstances. We have to continually borrow because we have declining revenues in the energy sector. But interrogate so that when you become the leaders, there is some institutional memory that takes the country forward. Because as I said on the last occasion, in 5, 10, 15 years, and I'm not pronouncing at anybody's particular age, but in 5, 10, 15 years' time, they're going to be a new slate of leaders in the country, and we would really not want to start from a tabula rasa, because we're having conversations around the energy transition for Trinidad and Tobago, which is going to have serious implications. We're having conversations around electric vehicles. The mechanics that we have now that deal with combustion, they're not going to be dealing with those vehicles. Young people have to be involved in that. So I'm suggesting that as a concrete measure to take Trinidad and Tobago forward, I think we need to have some kind of public-private funded institution, think tank, that puts some of our youthful minds to work. How do we talk about economic diversification? How do we talk about digitization in Trinidad and Tobago? I just traveled, and the country I came from, they have a phone and an identity card, and all of their financial transactions are done through that particular medium. Someone was telling me that he has not used a banknote for the last 8 years. And I was shocked. And this is the direction in which our country, our youth, that's the direction they're going. The fact that we're seeing so many good things and bad things coming out on social media is because we have a very savvy, tech-savvy youth population, and we have to embrace that. So the conversation around the budget, I don't think we're going to have time about the orange economy, because I know you're going to have to get here other guests. But the conversation around involving youth in the budget process, I think it will be a novel idea to have a think tank of youth whose only job is to monitor and evaluate across, between and among all of the intersecting spaces that contribute to a national budget, and to see whether or not it is in fact contributing to the sustainable development of Trinidad and Tobago and to the sustainable development of the youth of Trinidad and Tobago, all of Trinidad and Tobago, but certainly those persons who will have to inherit Trinidad and Tobago in years to come.
From that point that you're making, then they would have to, I would think of perhaps the university could be a good bed. Why is it a good bed?
I will volunteer. I can't volunteer at the university. I can volunteer myself.
I'm looking at the academic freedom as well.
Yeah, I think there is an
people to feel constrained by.
I think there is an opportunity, and I know that I would be willing, and I know I have one or two colleagues who would be willing to facilitate that kind of conversation.
And then I think, I just follow up from your thing, the question of they can be empowered to do research and research papers out. And there need to be something. There is something that the governments have committed to based on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. There is a process that when they realize governments will not be very diligent in implementing, called the general measures of implementation, which is certain things. So for instance, like the think tanks could look at some basic questions that are asked. Does the policy incorporate the needs and priorities of the diverse youth population? Okay, how will the policy impact the youth population? That's in terms of the negative or positive, but also how will they utilize or optimize the social intellectual capital of the youth to achieve those things, which is, I think, the point. So there are some of those things. But one thing we have to be clear on is that in developing something, so to make sure it does not become an elitist
No. That is not the intent. And that is why I'm saying that you draw from a diverse group, including persons who are entrepreneurs, who want to essentially contribute to the development of the SME sector, because a key instrument in terms of Trinidad and Tobago's economic diversification has to come from the SME sector. So I think,
and also by way of the research, so the kind of research they do, well, it's action-oriented research, but that means they will have, obviously, the persons you will not be able to bring on, but you need to get them. So, for instance, these young women and young men running through the traffic and selling things, and you know what I mean? Or you see young people around the fish industry, you know, clean up the fish and making a living thing. What are they thinking? You know, those kinds of things. The windshield. Well, one day in another forum, I raised the thing about how do we know what are the needs and priorities of young commercial sex workers, and I was reminded that's against the law. You know,
but it's a reality.
You know,
and
so
unless we confront the reality, then
I agree with that we need that kind of focus thing.
And we need to have an open mind as well, because burying our heads in the sand around commercial sex workers, it does not help the problem. Which is why in some countries, of course, they have red light districts and they manage it. You know,
and now it's online.
That's right.
The pandemic has been online.
So let's be honest about what we need to. But I think there are opportunities for us to be a little more creative in terms of how we engage our young persons.
I think that's good. You could have a process where you open it up, you indicate that this thing is a new initiative. We are asking people to apply.
That's
right. You can have a kind of independent panel that is looking at what is the criteria.
Absolutely.
The criteria doesn't
and the panel
have to
will
be
include young persons as well.
Yeah, to select who
Perhaps you could actually answer. You know, the solutions that you're both proposing. Doesn't that require then of the government to cede some level of power over to somebody else? If you're saying you want,
it's a think tank. It is not a parliamentary operation. It is a think tank that is going to report to its constituents, primarily young persons, but also to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, saying that we are dissatisfied. So it is a way of essentially evidence-based and not old talk and not political talk. It is saying that this is what you indicated that you in your budget year for fiscal 2024-2025 would be done. We have done our research. We have found that perhaps an alternative solution or complementary solution to dealing with this particular issue is X, Y, and Z. And we open it up for debate. And then the young persons, the youth, then become active participants instead of observers of a national budgetary process. They are then actively involved. Now, they may take on board, they may not take on board, but trust me, politically, it will make sense to take some of the solutions on board.
Because if you find the policy has impacted positively,
then you use it.
But you have to report that.
But not just
as well,
that.
You know?
We have 5-year life cycles, so you need people to come back.
What we have to get to is something I keep saying all the time. But we know that all of us, even though we are a youth adjacent, whatever, we all know that one of the characteristics of young people is the propensity for risk-taking. And I just cannot get it why we keep looking at that major characteristic of youth as an anomaly. We criminalize it, we stigmatize it. But that is the opportunity to incorporate it. If you're talking about, if you're taking young people on board, you have to be able to understand risk-taking is a major thing. That is why they may look at the thing and say, this thing you tell me, that's how we were doing it from since Adam was a boy and things. So it doesn't make sense.
And even dealing with the topic of the day, crime, I think if we had youth perspectives on the causes and the effects of crime, I think we would be able to get a greater return on our investment in national security in Trinidad and Tobago.
So we're talking about that propensity to take risks. So Lawrence, how do you think we address that? How do you think we invest in that propensity to take risk and convert something that is risky into something that is beneficial?
Well, how do we manage risk? And that's the conversation that I think we need to get to, because it comes back to Dr. Charles's previous point about the system and how the system is designed. The system is not designed to facilitate real entrepreneurship, real risk-taking, real change, because the system is designed to maintain power and control. But I want to come back to the idea that you all are presenting, because it makes sense. Because what we've been trying to do at Heroes is get young people into spaces. If you can have a government that now takes a stance and says, we are creating a space to include young people, we have all of the people that the Parliament have brought together for this series of conversations have been saying the same thing. Heroes has a network of 500 young people who we work with right now. I don't know what the others have, but if you bring together the Heroes, the youth councils, all of these people together and say, hey, we're starting here. We're starting with these networks of young people, and we want to work together, because it has to be about partnership and it has to be about collaboration. And private sector, we want your support, because when you hit that point, Dr. Attzs, about the funding of it, we expect young people to volunteer for everything. And young people need to live too.
Yes, precisely.
So how are we creating these spaces with sustainable development? We really are critical about sustainable development, about changing the ways in which we operate so that we leave the world better. And funding the things that can bring about the change that we all know we want, but we may not have the capacity to deliver on.
But just to be clear, Lawrence, the idea of the think tank just came to me as we were chatting this morning. But it is meant to be independent. It is meant to be away from it. We'll draw on the various experiences because we know that there is a lot of investment and cross-fertilization that has taken place across different youth spaces in Trinidad and Tobago. But it is meant to be independent, and it is meant to address the specific issue that we were called on to discuss today, the issue of the budget. So how do we ensure that in moving forward, the investments that are being made, so government calls them expenditures, but they're actually investments. So the roads that are being built, and it is broad brush, it is the roads that are being built. There is a school in a rural area, and there are children who are not going to school, etc. So
I don't want to cut you off, Dr. Attzs.
No, but I know we're running out of time.
A point that I don't want to get left out of the conversation, because you all keep mentioning this whole concept of marginalization and that urban-rural divide. So Leeooi, what do you think? What measures do you think the government can take from a budgetary stance or even from a policy stance to address specific challenges faced by disadvantaged or marginalized youth?
So I would like to propose education. So in terms of when you're dealing with marginalization, rural societies, different types of persons, young people, you generally have them come together in a school context. And that is the environment where we get to shape and mold and train and educate and that kind of thing. We need to kind of transform our curriculum away from just the standardized tests and the math that I can go to ChatGPT and get them pull up. I mean, those things, yes, have significance and it have its importance, but we have bigger things to deal with. And therefore, we need to spend more time in terms of developing our curriculum to directly attack those things. So we need to be talking about the budget process in school and from a primary school level. We need to be talking about the functions of the parliament, what really happens when something goes to CPC, what really happens when something goes to the cabinet, because we have our young people, our children coming up, not understanding their everyday lives and the environment that they live in, and so they become desensitized to the process. So I would say our education system is that part that we have the ability to make changes. We don't have to take what somebody says. We need to teach our children, right? And yes, a lot of people now are thinking about homeschooling and all of these kind of things, but we have direct access as parents, as teachers, as citizens within society to say, listen, you need to have a class on how to do taxes. You need to have a class on what the budget entails. So now when your children are exposed to this and socialized, as Dr. Attzs says, they will be able to engage in the conversation in a meaningful way. If I do not understand the language, then I'm not going to speak with you. I'm not going to speak and give my opinion. So I would say that the education is a critical aspect and a solution for us to get in there and get into the minds of our young people.
Well, you raised a critical point, which is a very critical point, which is, I think it's kind of going contrary to what, naturally as a people, if you look at historically, our societies, all of a sudden everything is institutionalized. Mm-hmm. We have, and I don't know if there's a reason, I don't want to suggest there is an ulterior motive, but we have essentially emasculated the power of communities. Mm-hmm. Communities were the places where we created solutions for peace building, where, we created solutions as to the same thing. How do we, what kind of education, not even education, the consciousness development. I cannot put in the education, the formal thing, but the kind of consciousness development, the kind of cultural literacy, that's where we develop it. And all of a sudden, we've kind of abandoned these things, or we don't recognize it, and we just, everything is institution.
One of the reasons is because we focus more on certification as opposed to education.
Everything is institution.
So certification is really eating away at the education.
And to add to Dr. Henry, we have a lot of community centers in this country that's just sitting down collecting dust, right? Even, and I'm going to bring it back now to a business perspective, when you have SMEs who need to hold trainings and workshops, have a store to set up, let them use the community centers. Yeah. We have things there. It's not that we don't have resources. It's either they are mismanaged, underutilized, or it's just a barrier. Don't fear us. We are here and we want to do things. We don't just want to survive in this society. We want to thrive. And if it is we have the opportunity to thrive, then we can innovate. If we have the opportunity to thrive, then we can add to just the economic development of this country, and we will be more in tools to be a part of the budgetary process, the political arena, add to the leadership, and let's not talk too much about leadership crises, but to just be able to be good contributors to society.
Absolutely.
Just to add into that point, education, community development, everything that was just shared there, it comes back to that fundamental point of, are we having the meaningful youth inclusion in all of those decision-making spaces for where we want to go? So Dr. Attzs, yes, let's set up this think tank, because I think that is a step in the right direction that says we want transparency, accountability, and meaningful youth inclusion. But let's also make sure that the meaningful youth inclusion happen in all of the other spaces, because that is the only way we're going to get the sustainable change. It can't just be one-off. It has to be, we as a society go back to the community model of how do we get everybody involved in our development. Exactly.
The organizing model, and that is why there's also a critical role for the trade union movement.
Yeah. Right, so we're down to the wire. This has been some great conversation, and I just want to wrap up by just hearing briefly from each person, what do you want to see, or what do you look forward to seeing, having had this conversation in the next budget? So, Dr. Attzs, we can start with you.
Well, I think my wish list is very clear. I would like to see some consideration given to a think tank, because as someone mentioned in the conversation today, very often, and when I write about the budget, it's everybody waits for budget day, and budget day is about whether rice going up, flour going up, cigarette going up, gas going up, everybody, into the gas stations. And it doesn't help to build a society, and it doesn't help in terms of educating a society. I am a firm believer in education, not certification, in education, because with education you can then make informed choices based on the circumstances and based on the changing circumstances. So I would like to see a more engaged Trinidad and Tobago, and I think a more engaged youth population of Trinidad and Tobago through something like the think tank that I suggested would be the start of that process. I'm very clear it's not meant to be a political entity.
Yep.
It is meant to be an independent entity that provides a space for the youth population of Trinidad and Tobago and the youth population to come to understand that they have a role and function, and that Trinidad and Tobago is ready and willing to embrace them and their creative ideas and their new ideas, and we've created a space for them to do that, and we will provide the funding because we recognize the worth and the value proposition of our young population. So that is what I would like to see in Budget 2024.
Thank you very much, Dr. Attzs. Lawrence?
I think we've spoken quite a lot about the why, the where, and the how today. So we have some good ideas. What I think I would like to see more of is more child-friendly and youth-friendly education. And it's going to come from the meaningful youth inclusion, because young people generally don't understand. I mean, I met with our youth advisory team, 30 of them, 80% don't pay attention to the budget because they don't understand how it affects them. And it's not that the information is not out there. Young people are not going to sit down and listen to Parliament, to be honest, to hear the budget debates and hear what everybody has to say. So how do we bring in young people, use them to help understand how we need to start communicating with young people, not to, with young people, and start that education of young people towards getting them more meaningfully involved into the process, into the systems across the board.
Dr. Charles?
Well, two things. One is that I would like to see a signal in the budget that the government, unlike governments of the Commonwealth, the government here as well, have really relieved themselves of that myth that there are not economic returns when you invest in youth. So I want to see a greater dedicated investment in youth, perhaps even from a narrower standpoint for the Ministry of Youth, or soon to be the National Youth Development Agency. I think the government should, in this budget, look to establish a youth development fund that is independent, well, let's say independently, but it's managed by a grouping of stakeholders, government, young people, whatever, that can be making decisions in a very independent way on where do we invest on certain youth. The other thing I would like to say, I don't know if it's feasible for 24, but after, we have NEDCO, we have DISCO, we have DATCO, we have all of them. Investing in youth entrepreneurship. I would like to hear a Minister of Finance tell me what has been the contribution of the youth entrepreneurship sector to GDP or something. So, is that impossible to calculate?
It is not impossible, but I think we've not focused on it.
That's
so
what I'm saying.
and we need to focus on
because
it.
Because I do not believe we should promote youth entrepreneurship as just, okay, a little work.
Empty, yes.
It has to be part of the of creating wealth, a part of a changing landscape of the private sector. So I would like to hear some kind of conversation around how are young youth-owned businesses contributing to impacting, changing the way of doing business. That's it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Charles.
Yeah.
To the Ministry of Digital Transformation, there is an opportunity for, whether it's an app or a website or something to be developed, to ask for citizens and youth participation in sending forth policy recommendations towards the budget. And this is ministry speak, so you can put together a task force to go through each recommendation that is submitted by your general public to identify areas that is possible to adopt. And not just to take the information, because we have participation and you get information, but to be transparent about what was submitted, what is possible, what can be tabled for 5 years, 10 years, 3 years, 2 years, and what is impossible based on our context as an economy. We have the digital technology, we have the ideas sitting in person's mind. Give them the platform to be able to contribute to the discussion, take their ideas, see how we could formulate it into policy and apply it. That is what I would like to see. Not just part participation, but real inclusion.
Indeed. Yep.
Meaningful engagement, looking at the status quo, identifying the problems, and meaningful solutions. This has been our conversation on youth and the budget process. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their time, and I'd like to thank all members of the viewing and listening public for tuning in via the Parliament channel, ParlView on YouTube, or Radio 105.5 FM. And we do look forward to yet again hearing, sometime hopefully in the future, from the voices of the people who have the solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good one.
Well done.